technique for data analysis is not a valid way of establishing scientific truths. The media seems to be legitimate evidence that science in psychology is a fraud. Psychology is considered a social science because psychological principles affect social life, people and institutions alike. Oftentimes, the purpose of any psychological research is to make the world a better place to live in, that is, socially. Just like other scientists, psychologists embrace scientific values in their research. In turn, these values shape psychologists and manifest themselves as attitudes in which all scientific studies are made. Any person who embodies these characteristics is considered to be a scientist. In this light, biologists, chemists, physicists are no different from each other when they practice curiosity. A scientist has a curious mind. He constantly finds interest in anything related to his field of study. For instance, psychologists are eternally interested in finding out the causes of behaviors and mental processes. Skepticism. A scientist does not accept claims at face value. He digs deep and questions supposed truths and assumptions made in his field of study. For instance, psychologists challenge sweeping and simplistic claims on the nature of personality and intelligence. Objectivity. Human language is said to be full of ambiguity. In order to eliminate confusion and prevent misinterpretation, a scientist strives to clarify his words. Thus, a psychologist may define classroom self-esteem as the frequency in which a student participates in class. Critical thinking. A scientist is critical not just of other people's work, but also of himself. He evaluates the evidence and the method rigorously, identifying both the strengths and weaknesses of a research study. For example, psychologists typically include recommendations at the last part of their research studies to indicate how future studies can improve upon them. Thus, psychologists do not try to hide the limitations of their studies, but instead exposes them to help consumers make informed choices about their studies. Some disciplines in psychology are straightforwardly sciences, and some are less so. Please note that I'm treating something, being a science, as having the characteristics of sciences. There's a U.S. tendency to treat science merely as a status award, showing the activity is approved of, in much the same way that something might be called art. I'm not using that definition, because it doesn't produce a useful result for this question. Definitely a science animal behavior, under some of the strictest controls for any science experiment ever, the relationship between experimental conditions and observable behavior is rigorously analyzed. It follows the experimental method, uses the same format for its experiments as biology or chemistry, and is famously cautious in its conclusions. Cognitive psychology builds models of human behavior and then tests them under controlled conditions. Not obviously different from anything done by other sciences, save that it is the behavior of people being measured rather than something else. Medical model-based clinical psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. So, there's some debate as to whether medicine is a science. I'm inclined to say no, because it uses case studies rather than experimentation, and results are necessarily partly an evaluation rather than an empirical measure. However, if it is, then the studies around patients would also qualify. Science-based, but weak experimental controls. Social psychology, developmental psychology. These are set up as sciences, and follow the scientific model. However, they have great difficulty enforcing proper experimental controls, because to put the subjects in a controlled environment will itself influence their behavior. There are some clever ways around this, but in general the problem remains correlation-based artificial intelligence, economics, sociology, experimental philosophy, anthropology. These disciplines use scientific tools, specifically the statistical analysis of correlations arising from observable data. However, they don't practice proper experimental controls, and they often rely on single-instance case studies, such as specific groups, historical instances, or particular systems. As such, their analysis shows that particular things are correlated, but doesn't show anything more. The meat of the work tends to be informed speculation around the correlations. Not science, no, not even a little bit mathematics, philosophy, politics. These disciplines are around working out the logical consequences of certain beliefs or axioms. They can make use of observation and measurement, but rarely rely on it.
So what this was saying was there's different types of methods when it comes to collecting data. And so what she was saying towards the end, we're gonna move it backwards, is when it comes to case studies, she was like, I don't know if that's a real thing. Yes, in the field of psychology, we like case studies. We deal with case studies because even though it might be about one person, it might be about one group, it might be about one phenomenon. Again, we learn a lot of information and how to be able to use that information for other parts of development. Am I making sense? So case studies are very important, but they're just not as relevant because they're very specific and they're very tailored. Then, just like she said, you have experimental, and experimental comes in all kinds of things. Like you guys are doing experimental studies every single day and don't even realize it. When we're over here trying new things, that's an experiment. When we're over here, testing our abilities on certain activities, that's considered an experiment. Well, we do that to other people as well. And when we do it in a controlled environment, and we have what we call variables, that means different factors that contribute to the study, right? So then you have these things, that's what we're gonna call them, which is the sample population, and the sample population are your test subjects. That's a mouthful. But you're gonna see it when we pull up an article. And with these test populations, as the sample, that's they call them the sample population, you have it where you have a controlled group and a controlled environment, and then you have a group that's not controlled, meaning that they're just being tested in their regular environment. So the one that's being controlled, meaning that you probably give things to or you take away things from so that you can test the results, that would be considered your independent variable. So for example, if I wanted to know if people did better on an exam with having notes versus people who had no notes, who do you think is going to do better on the exam?
People with notes.
Right. And see, the thing is, the people with notes, they're controlled because they have all the information. Now, if I took their notes away, will they be getting the same scores as the people with no notes? We don't know. And so this population depends on this population. So we're going to learn more about that because, again, this is what you do every day. You have an independent variable versus dependent variable. If I do this, is this going to happen? And then here's another thing. We have what we call correlations. Just because this happened, is this really going to happen? How many times do we have to test it to see if this is really going to happen? Or was it just a coincidence? So these are the things that we test when we're talking about, in psychology and science. So again, on the side over here, you have your library, okay? You're gonna hit databases, and we're gonna go to the first one, academic one file. And we're gonna go to psychology. And let's see, let's talk about stress. So let's see what they're talking about here. You don't want to narrative review. Oh, this is something that you might want to be interested in again, just because of the fact that from the jump it has a background, result, and conclusion. It doesn't have everything that I would be looking for, so let me find another one that has everything that I would be more so looking for. Yeah, this looks more like it. So it has an abstract background, so it's telling you the methods, it has the results, and it has a conclusion. So again, to make life easy on yourself, you want to find articles that just right off the bat look just like this, because it's going to make it very simple for you to read to determine, is that something that I'm even interested in? So we're not wasting our time and falling asleep, because that happens. All right. So, let's read this one real quick and then we'll move on. So medical students suffer above average rates of depression, anxiety, stress, poor sleep, and life dissatisfaction, which impacts their performance. In addition to the demands of medical study, medical students in Gaza Strip face coping with life in an area marred by chronic conflict and poverty. That's pretty intense. And that sounds about right, like who sleeps in a war zone? Especially if you're constantly having to attend to people who are hurting in the hospital. And they need all the help that they can get. So of course they're gonna be the students and anybody else back in college. So it's intense over there. So what they did was, they used a cross-sectional study, assessed medical students at 2 medical schools in the Gaza Strip. Students were randomized according to university, sex, and academic level. So they told you how they broke up the categories for each factor, okay? So screening employed the DASS-21. So these right here are tools. So when we're mentioning our instruments, that's exactly what you're doing, folks. You're just mentioning the instrument when we're talking about something, and I'll show you a paper when we do that. You're not going into the instrument, you're not telling the history of the instrument, you are just mentioning the instrument in your paper, okay? Because there's a gazillion instruments out here in these streets to measure different things, all right? So, that's what they use, that's what they said right there. And the ordinal logistic regression was used to investigate predictors of anxiety, stress, depression, sleep, quality, and the SWLS stages. Potential predictors of poor sleep quality were assessed by binary logistic regression, and multivariable logistic regression was implemented to determine the effect of the covariates. So yeah, you would pretty much just summarize that up when you write your paper, and I'm gonna show you how to do that. So they talked about the results. They said 362 medical students participated. So that would be your sample population. That's who participated. That would be the N. When you see an N in the study. If you see an N equal something, that means the sample population, but they did it a little differently. Different stages of depression, anxiety, and stress symptoms were prevalent in 67, 73, and 65% of the students. So for depression, 69, anxiety was the highest of 73, and stress is 65. Poor sleep quality was prevalent in 70, or we'll say 80% of the students. And 46 of the medical students were dissatisfied with their lives. Low income was associated with higher rates of extremely severe anxiety, with higher rates of moderate depression. Poor sleep quality was associated with higher rates of all stage anxiety, stress, and depression, and a univariate regression, and with higher odds of moderate anxiety, mild, moderate, and extreme severe depression, and multivariable regression. So the variables that they're focusing on is depression, sleep, anxiety, and what else? And stress. So that's why they say a multivariable regression, because they were considering all 4 factors. And so what are your thoughts about this abstract? Do you think like that makes sense, that's what we've read so far? Well, let's see. It's saying that medical students in Gaza Strip suffer from high rates of depression and anxiety, symptoms, stress, poor sleep, and life dissatisfaction compared to several other countries and full global prevalence. Medical schools in Gaza should be put forward strategies to limit the psychological burdens received by their students. So what is one thing this article has taught you in just that short period of time?
That the medical students in the Gaza Strip suffer from higher rates of depression and anxiety.
Right. So what do you think somebody who's a medical student would want to know about this? Because if I'm in a medical school,
You probably don't want to go to the Gaza Strip.
and just because they're on the Gaza Strip, does that mean that we can't relate to a lot of the stuff that's going on with them? Because if you're in medical school and you're doing clinicals, sometimes your clinicals are 10, maybe 14 hours a day. You don't think that's gonna impact your sleep?
It is.
You know? You're poor in medical school. Poor. I didn't say poor, nice. Poor. Like, we're always looking for free food. That's how poor, okay? You don't think that's gonna impact you just because we're 500 gazillion miles away? No. So these articles are here to help, again, us understand if this is happening in one side of the world, could this possibly be happening on this side of the world? But then it's like, well, what are their factors? Well, are we experiencing the same factors too? Or is it just these factors that are gonna cause all the distress that we're mentioning? Or is it other factors? So this is why we do research. And when they talk about limitations at the end of the project, we look for those so that we can find ways to better improve what happened or what's going on. Am I making sense?
Yes.
So what are your thoughts about this research stuff? Because in like 4 weeks, you're gonna be writing. That's your real test. Go ahead.
I have a question about seeing the differences between variables and independent.
So the independent variable is the one you're gonna manipulate. And that's the one that's gonna make this one change if not. So the dependent is dependent upon what the independent does. So if the independent variable changes, we wanna see, does the dependent variable change? But the independent variable is the one who's getting the treatment. Does that make more sense? Any other questions? Thoughts? Go ahead.
The question about marker is open and it's driving me crazy.
Did you find the cap?
Oh, it is.
I will be, thank you. So again, this is just an example of what it is that you wanna look for. You wanna look for these main things. I think now is a good time to get started. Go ahead.
How did your
Oh, let me get there. So one of the things that I would do, I'm just suggesting, I'm not telling you what to do, I'm just suggesting. It's very helpful though. Once you find your article that you wanna write about, so whatever you wanna write about, I don't care what it is. I've had people write about why they paint the color blue on the room versus red. And it does make a difference, colors make difference, they talk about colors. Even with nail polish, I've had people talk about nail polish in their papers and how that affects your mood. So, you can write about absolutely anything, there's no whole bars, right? So once you find the paper that you like, you're gonna start reading through it. And what I would suggest is every time you read a paragraph, you write down a sentence. Okay? Because this serves two purposes. Number one, you're not gonna lose your place. And number two, you're writing your paper along the way. So I'm answering half your question, I'll get there. But these are like some easy techniques to help you streamline how to write your paper. Okay? So for every paragraph, write 1 or 2 sentences about it. Okay? So let me get to that part. The first thing you're gonna do is, again, come up with the title page. And then you're gonna introduce the information. So, like for this paper, it was the pornography and sexual orientation and oblivion sexism in young adults in Spain. So, I start out just giving some facts that the paper started off talking about. And what the paper started off talking about was how Pornhub was the most recorded porn site. And so what they found out was they get 131 million visits daily. Okay, so every time you, let's go back here. Every time you write your thought about this, what you're going to do is you need to reference it. So every time I make a statement, I have to reference it because it wasn't just my statement. It came from the actual article itself. Am I making sense?
Yes.
So every time I have a thought over here, like medical students are generally going to be vulnerable to higher rates of anxiety. So if I paraphrase this and I put it on my paper over here, right after that sentence that I just paraphrased, I'm going to put the reference of that article. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Do I have any questions? Any comments? Any concerns? So every time you write a sentence, literally, you're going to reference that sentence. Because your thoughts came directly from after you read this and you wrote a sentence about it. So you're referencing it. Am I making sense? Okay. So the paper starts out with just giving some statistics. That's how I like to start my paper out to engage the reader. I'm gonna start off with some facts, with some statistics. So that's what I said. One of the most popular erotic free digital platforms, Pornhub, recorded and reported over 130 million visits daily during the year 2021, with the most viewers being men between the ages 18 through 24. Then we put the reference, because I didn't say this, they said this, it's what the research says, okay? And so it says the site reported that 79 of its users are from America and another 26% of its users are from Spain. That was a fact, okay? With the reference. These free digital erotic platforms provide pornographic content that seems to objectify violence against women, with men being the recipient of pleasure. This is what they were talking about. And so it says high levels of sexism have been reported in studies regarding pornography. However, there has been a lack of research analyzing the effects of sexism in young adults from pornography consumption, with the research desiring to understand how to conceptualize the theory of oblivion sexism and the impact it has on young adults. So this is basically the background of why they're doing what they're doing. So that's kind of how you start your paper, okay? And then you're going to talk about the method. So what did they do? Well, they started off with a sample population, okay? So we talk about the sample population. They surveyed men and women between 18 and 35 that resided in Spain. They told me where they got the providence from, or where they got the most people from, how they got the people, okay? So that's what they talked about. And so at the end of the day, they ended up with 2,346 men and women who participated in the study. Then we talked about the instrument. And like I said, you're just writing down what the instruments that they use. You're not exasperating the instruments, you're not going into detail about the instruments, you're just writing them down. Okay? Then you talk about the results. So the results is what happened. So once I'm gonna put this paper up too on week 5, so you guys can start to, but I want you to start thinking about stuff that you want to talk about. And so then you talk about the conclusion and then the limitations. And that's how you write your paper. And then you have your last thoughts, and then you have your reference page. Okay? Now, I know this isn't our most exciting class, but again, I wanted to get these things out the way right now, so that by the time we really get into the swing of things, you're gonna be really comfortable and really familiar and understand what it is that you're looking for, so that you're not frightened and feeling overwhelmed. And like I said, during week 6, like, I pop in, so if you need help, but I'm giving you the space to like really work on this, because this would be considered like your first big project. Am I making sense? And you like, even though I say the minimum is 3 pages, you are literally gonna write 7 to 8 pages breaking this information down. All right? So, do I have any questions about our first week? Any comments? You still stirred? I promise the class is gonna get fun. It's just this stuff is like the bones of what psychology is before we talk about the fun stuff. And we can't talk about the fun stuff without talking about the boring stuff first, because we had to do the boring stuff first in order to get to the fun stuff. There's a lot of it. All right, if you don't have any questions, comments, or concerns,